Now let's look at a demo of how we can run a distributed load test using this setup that I've configured. In this demo, we're going to run a distributed load test against a sample ASP.NET MVC application. We're going to be using the MVC Music Store application sample that I've been using throughout this course. If you browse to it, you'll see the home page looks something like this. If we refresh, you'll see this is running live. Now note that I have changed the URL, so I'm no longer hitting localhost. I'm now hitting my machine name on a known port, 8089. Now because of that, I've had to go into each of my web tests, and I've parameterized them so that I can use that same URL. So each one of these web tests is using now that 8089 port on my dev machine. And then I created a load test that takes in these three web tests, has a certain mix involved, and I set up a step load pattern so that I'm starting with 50 users and stepping up with a rate of every 10 seconds, I'm going to add 10 users. So basically 1 user per second to a maximum of 1,000 users. I also, when I set this up, I added some counter sets, and I've set up the MVC Music Store so that it is using a remote database because it's a little more real-worldy. So under web config, you'll notice that I've got now a Music Store entities entry that's pointing to my laptop, my Steve E6500, using integrated security. So it'll actually talk to that server. And then I've also added the SQL counter by default so I can monitor how many SQL connections there are. Now getting the performance monitor to work so that I can view those performance counters from my test machine requires a little bit of setting things up. Since it's a Windows 7 box, I had to start the remote registry service, and I had to make sure that my machine or my user account on my test rig machine is actually in the performance counter users group on the Steve E6500 machine. Once I got that, I got it to work. And a good way to troubleshoot whether or not you've got performance counters working is to run perfmon, which will run performance monitor like this. And from here, you can add additional counters from any given computer. And so you can see I've added Steve E6500, and when I browse to that, I'm able to view different information for it. For instance, let's say processor. And if everything is working, it'll actually let me view the counters for it. Now sometimes it's slow. And then once I have the list of counters, I can go to something like percent processor time. You see that that machine only has 2 processors, so it's different from my 8-way dev machine that I'm using here. But I can add that and say OK. And now down here, you'll see I'm collecting data for batch requests per second as well as processor time. And to get the batch requests per second to run, we can go back to our browser now and simply hit refresh. And you can see that that got us a few database hits on that server. So that's sort of our smoke test to make sure everything is configured correctly. I've also gone onto my laptop and hit this URL and verified I was able to browse to it to make sure that that works. You want to make sure your firewall isn't preventing access, especially if you're using a non-standard port like I'm doing at the moment. Then you'll want to do your configuration. So on this machine, I'm running my controller here, so I need to configure my test controller, and I'm setting everything up to run as me. I'm an administrator on this machine as well as on my laptop, so it's just running as Steve with my password, and I've configured everything with the localhost SQL Express machine, and I've added some virtual users so I can go up to 2,000 virtual users now here. So more than enough for what I'm trying to do. With these 2 machines, I'll never get close to that number. So we'll close this. I've also configured the agent software, and I've configured the test agent on both my desktop machine, Steve IBP desktop, as well as on my laptop. And I'm running these under the same user account just to make everything work easily. And I'm using the default test controller here with port 6901. So I've registered this agent with the same machine. And on my laptop, I did the same thing, but I had to put in, instead of localhost, I put in Steve IBP desktop here so that it could talk to it. Now, to verify that you've got your agents configured correctly, the next thing you can do is go under your Test tab in Visual Studio 2010 and go under Manage Test Controllers. And here you should see all of your agents are set up. Now, something else you can do from this screen is you can configure how much of the work each of these agents should do, as well as a few other things. So in this case, if we look at the properties for my laptop, you can see that it's weighted at 100. And you can do some stuff with IP switching, which I'm not going to have time to talk about today, as well as add some attributes, which we're also not going to do at this time. On my desktop, it's going to be doing the most work because it has the controller as well as the web server running on it. And so I don't want it to be burdened with running so many of the actual tests. So I've set its weighting to 50. So it's only going to run about 1/3 of the actual tests, while the laptop does about 2/3. But remember, the laptop is also running the database. Now, in an ideal scenario, we'd have probably 4 machines so that we could have a controller, we could have a separate agent. Neither one of those would be doing any other work. And we'd have our web server and our database server each dedicated to those tasks and not involved in the testing otherwise. Unfortunately, my budget for this module did not allow me to go and buy 4 new servers for that purpose. So I'm just using my development laptop and my development desktop, and they will do just fine for our purposes here today. So we'll say OK, we'll close. And the next thing that we need to do is add a new test settings file. So by default, you have something like a local test settings file that gets added as soon as you start working with web tests and load tests and things like that. We want to add a new one. So right click on solution items and just say add new item. And look under here, there's a test settings template. Go ahead and say add. And then the main thing that we want to do when we look at this is go under roles and say that our test execution method should be remote execution. And then we need to set a controller, which we'll just say is localhost. And now this is telling us that it's connected. So at this point, we could just save this and we're done. There's some other things we could set here though. For instance, when we look at hosts, it's a good idea for you to switch this to say run 64-bit on 64-bit machines, just so you can take advantage of that where possible. Generally, it won't make a huge difference, but it's just something to look at. And then you can also do the usual settings that you can change that I talked about in previous modules. For instance, you can set the timeouts, the way the unit tests run, web tests, how they run, whether to use think times or not, etc. So I'm not going to save this one because I've already created one that I've called test rig. So we'll delete this other one here. I'm going to use the test rig test settings. Now, to make sure that you're using the right one, you need to go under test and say select active test settings. And from here, just make sure the checkbox is on the test settings file that you want to be using at this time. All of that is set. We've done our work to set everything up. Now we can actually run the test.